Last time we spoke about the beginning of the Battle of Nanjing. As a relentless tide of war approached Nanjing in December of 1937, fear gripped its residents. As atrocities unfolded in the countryside, civilians flocked towards safety zones, desperate for refuge. Under the command of General Tong Xiongju, the Chinese forces prepared for a fierce defense, determined to hold their ground against the technologically superior invaders. Despite heavy losses and internal strife, hopes flickered amongst the defenders, fueled by the valor of their troops. Key positions like the Old Tiger's Cave became battlegrounds, exemplifying the fierce resistance against the Japanese advance. On December the 9th, as artillery fire enveloped the city, a battle for the Gate of Enlightenment commenced. Both sides suffered grievously, with the Chinese soldiers fighting to the last, unwilling to yield even an inch of their soil. Each assault from Japan met with relentless counterattacks, turning Nanjing into a symbol of perseverance amidst impending doom, as the siege marked a critical chapter in the conflict, foreshadowing the brutal events that would unfold. This episode is the Battle of Nanjing. Well, hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all of that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. I actually have a huge favor to ask. I recently released an episode of my YouTube channel about the Fukuryu, or kamikaze frogmen. Needless to say, YouTube algorithm doesn't like the word kamikaze. So if you have a chance, could you please go check it out, leave a like, and hey, comment where you came from. If you'd like to further support me, please check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. By mid-December, the landscape surrounding Nanjing was eerily quiet. The Japanese army marched through what seemed to be desolate fields and mountains, but they were not truly empty. Civilians were scarce, most having fled, but a few remained in their homes, hiding in cellars and barns, clinging to the hope that the war would bypass them somehow. Meanwhile, thousands of Chinese soldiers left behind and unable to keep pace with their units still posed a significant danger to the Japanese forces. The Japanese army had not truly conquered the territory east and south of Nanjing. They had merely passed through. Mop-up operations became a top priority. Soldiers from the 16th Infantry Division, stationed near Purple Mountain, spent early December conducting these missions far from the city walls. Chinese stragglers may be hiding in this area, and they must be flushed out. Any small structure of no strategic value to the Japanese army must be burnt. This command rang out to the division soldiers as they spread across the countryside around Unicorn Gate. Soon isolated fires began to illuminate the horizon, one for each home. Soldiers from the 9th Infantry Division, who were not directly engaged in combat south of the Gate and Enlightenment, were also conducting similar mop-up operations. On December the 11th at noon, one squad received orders to investigate a suspicious farm building. Although it had been searched previously, movement inside prompted renewed action. The Japanese entered carefully, moving from room to room. In the basement, they discovered 8 Chinese soldiers who offered no resistance, immediately raising their hands in surrender. Bound together, they were brought outside. Using a few Chinese words, supplemented by sign language, the Japanese gathered that the Chinese had been in the vicinity where one of their comrades had been killed earlier that day. Unanimously, they decided the prisoners should be executed in front of their comrade's grave. Some of the older soldiers hesitated, reluctant to partake in the killings, leaving it to the younger ones to carry out the order. Soon, 8 headless bodies lay sprawled before the solitary Japanese grave. On the morning of the 11th, the first soldiers of the 6th Japanese Infantry Division finally spotted the distant city wall of Nanjing. They had been engaged in a fierce combat for nearly 2 days, attempting to dislodge the tenacious defenders of the Yuhatai Plateau, the elite soldiers of the 88th Division. In a desperate bid to maintain their foothold on Yuhatai, the 88th Division deployed its reserve 528th Regiment, along with a battalion of engineers. Despite their efforts, the regiment's ranks had been depleted, filled with inexperienced recruits, and their leadership was nearly obliterated, limiting their effectiveness. Under the relentless assaults from the Japanese forces, their defenses began to falter almost immediately. Faced with the stiff resistance at the Gate of Enlightenment, the Japanese shifted their focus to the Chinese Gate on the 11th. Japanese aircraft were summoned for tactical air support, forcing the 88th Division's defenders to retreat behind the wall. This withdrawal occurred swiftly and somewhat chaotically, allowing the Japanese to pursue them rather closely. Before the Chinese could regroup, 300 Japanese soldiers had breached the wall. Only the mobilization of all available forces enabled the Chinese to push the attackers back outside. Meanwhile, the left flank of the 88th Division, stationed east of the Chinese Gate, remained outside the wall. Here they clashed with elements of the 9th Japanese Division, but faced intense pressure, and they were compelled to fall back. By the end of the day, the Chinese division had shortened its defensive line, regrouping in front of the city wall. Plans for a nighttime counterattack were ultimately abandoned, as it became clear that the division's soldiers were too fatigued to mount an effective offensive. Overall, it proved to be a successful day for the Japanese 10th Army. Further south, the Kunozaki detachment successfully crossed the Yangtze River at Chiba Village, beginning their advance towards Puko. Its special amphibious training made the detachment ideally suited for the operation, but its limited numbers, essentially a reinforced infantry regiment, raised concerns at the field headquarters about whether it could accomplish the task alone. Prince Asaka proposed transporting part of the 13th Division across the Yangtze, further north to sever the railway connecting Tianjin to Puko, cutting off a potential retreat route for the Chinese forces that had already escaped Nanjing. On the 11th, Japanese artillery shells rained down relentlessly, targeting both the interior and the exterior of Nanjing city walls. Administrators of the safety zone were alarmed to witness several shells landing very close to its southern edge. In a bid to provide some semblance of security, American and foreign flags were raised around the zone's perimeter, though their protective influence against artillery fire from miles away was negligible. The leaders of the safety zone faced an unexpected dilemma: how to handle lawbreakers with the city courts now out of operation. That day they encountered a thief caught in an act. As Rabe noted in his diary, "We sentenced the thief to death, then pardoned him, and reduced his punishment to 24 hours in jail, and ultimately, due to the absence of a jail, we simply let him go." Refugees continued to pour in, with a total of 850 having found shelter at the Jining College. Vautrin and her colleagues began to feel that their initial estimate of 2,700 women and children seeking refuge on the campus was overly optimistic. They were soon proven wrong. On the banks of the Yangtze River, hundreds of injured soldiers and civilians were lining up to be ferried across to Puko, where trains awaited to transport them further inland and away from the danger. Many had been waiting for days without food. While ferries made continuous trips across the river to rescue as many as possible, the process was painfully slow. As of late December the 10th, approximately 1,500 wounded civilians remained stranded on the southern bank of the Yangtze. The Japanese forces were confronted by a fiercely determined enemy composed largely of young soldiers from the training division. These soldiers had the advantage of having been stationed near Purple Mountain for several years at this point, making them very familiar with the terrain. Additionally, they were part of an elite unit, groomed not just in equipment and training, but also instilled with a sense of nationalism rooted in Chiang Kai-shek's ideology. Yi Shikai, the commander of the division's 3rd Regiment, had set up his command post directly in the path of the primary Japanese advance, yet his regiment continued to resist. Despite the fierce resistance, the Japanese gradually gained control over the Purple Mountain area. General Nakajima Kesago, the commander of the 16th Division, visited an artillery observation post earlier in the day. He was pleased to receive reports that his troops had captured 2 peaks of Purple Mountain, and they were poised to take the main peak. Yet there loomed a problem on Nakajima's right flank. A widening gap was emerging between the 16th Division and the 13th Division, which had advanced along the southern bank of the Yangtze. There was a risk that Chinese forces could escape through this lightly guarded area. The 13th Division was stationed in the strategically important river port city of Jianjiang, preparing to cross the Yangtze. The Central China Area Army ordered the 13th Division to mobilize 3 infantry battalions and 1 artillery battalion. This new formation became known as the Yamada Detachment, after its commander, Yamada Senji, which were tasked with remaining on the Yangtze's southern bank and advancing westward to capture 2 Chinese fortresses along the river, Mount Wulong and Mount Mufu. This redeployment alleviated concerns about the gap, allowing the 16th Division to focus on the Nanjing city walls. As the sun dipped towards the horizon, one Captain Akio Junzo prepared for what he believed would be his final assault. He had been ordered to seize a hill northeast of the Sun Yat-sen Gate that overlooked the city entrance. His commander had told him, "The attack on Nanjing will likely be the last battle of this war. I hope your company can be at the front when the enemy lines are breached." The hill was fortified with numerous machine gun positions, reinforced with mud, bricks, and tiles, and connected by an intricate network of trenches. Dense rows of barbed wire lay before the positions, designed to halt attackers and expose them to machine gun fire. Additionally, the area was likely heavily mined, and Chinese soldiers maintained a high level of alertness. Akio knew this all too well. When he had crawled forward and slightly lifted his head to survey the landscape, he triggered a hail of bullets, one of which had grazed his helmet. Around the late afternoon, 4 mountain guns from the regimental artillery began firing on the Chinese positions, sustaining the bombardment for about an hour. By 5 p.m., as the winter sky darkened, Akio decided it was time to launch the attack. Expecting close-quarters combat, he instructed his men to carry only their rifles and small entrenchment tools. With the entire company poised to move, he dispatched a small group of soldiers ahead to cut openings in the barbed wire, while receiving covering fire from the mountain guns and rifles and machine gun fire. The remainder of the company advanced with swords raised and bayonets fixed. As they approached within about 700 feet of the enemy positions, the artillery bombardment ceased as planned. The enemy, still reeling from the ferocity of the earlier assault, scrambled in a panic from their trenches, retreating in disarray. Akio and his fellow soldiers pressed forward, cutting down any opposition in their path. Seizing the momentum, Akio charged to occupy the hill that had been his target. He found it deserted upon his arrival, and he sent a triumphant message back to the command, reporting that the objective had been achieved. However, the reply he received left him baffled. He was ordered to withdraw with his company and return to their lines. Apparently, the regimental command deemed the position too precarious. Sensing that a precious advantage had been squandered, Akio disregarded the order. Before his company could establish a defensive position on the hill, the Chinese launched quite a fierce counterattack. Lying down, the Japanese soldiers returned fire while frantically digging into the earth to fortify their position. Gradually, they began to form a rudimentary perimeter at the summit. The fighting continued into the night. Exhausted from days without sleep, many soldiers rotated between guard duty and rest, dozing off intermittently in their shallow trenches, reassuring one another that everything would be all right before drifting back to sleep. They successfully repelled all attempts by the Chinese to reclaim the hill, and they were eventually relieved. Now on the 11th, after leaving his capital, Chiang Kai-shek took time to reflect on everything that had happened in his diary. He reassured himself that his nationalist revolution would persist, regardless of whether he held Nanjing. Temporary defeat can be turned into eventual victory. Yet he did not fear so much the Japanese invasion itself, but rather how the weakening of his nationalist government might allow the communists to rise. He wrote about how his nation was on the brink of becoming a second Spain. While foreign invasions were undoubtedly disastrous, they could eventually be overcome, if not immediately, then over years or even decades. Sometimes this could be achieved merely by absorbing the outmatched invader and assimilating them into Chinese society. In contrast, internal unrest posed a much more fundamental threat to the survival of any regime. And let's be honest, as I've shown in this series going back to the mid-19th century, was it the foreign empires of Britain, France, and Russia that threatened to destroy the Qing dynasty, or was it the internal civil war brought on by the Taiping? As Chiang Kai-shek famously put it, "The Japanese were a treatable disease of the skin. Communism, however, was a disease of the heart." Chiang Kai-shek could accept a humiliating but rapid retreat from Nanjing. In his view, it would be far more difficult to recover from a bloody yet futile struggle for the city that might cost him what remained of his best troops. A prolonged defensive battle, he reasoned, would be a tragic waste, and it could shift the balance of power decisively in favor of the communists. This new mindset was reflected in a telegram he sent on late December the 11th to Tang Shangji. "If the situation becomes untenable, it is permissible to find the opportune moment to retreat, to regroup in the rear in anticipation of future counterattacks." Now, back at the action on the 12th, tankettes cautiously plunged into the Yuhatai Plateau. Unexpectedly, the Chinese defenders abandoned their positions and they rushed down the hillside towards Nanjing's walls. Upon discovering this, the Japanese tankettes opened fire on the retreating Chinese, cutting swaths through the masses and sending bodies tumbling down the slope. Many Japanese infantry caught up, joining in the slaughter and laughing as they reveled in the chaos. A tankette column escorted a group of engineers to Nanjing's wall and then drove east along the moat until they reached a large gate, flanked by 2 smaller openings, all securely shut. A chilling message was painted in blue, adorned on the gate's surface. Written in Chinese characters, it conveyed a stark warning. "We swear revenge on the enemy." The wall itself loomed 3 stories high, but the Japanese artillery was already targeting it. This was the Chinese gate. Now that Yuhatai was virtually in Japanese hands, capturing the gate had become the primary objective. At this location, the wall stood some 70 feet tall, protected by a 100-foot moat to the outside. All bridges spanning the moat had been destroyed. The area around the gate was heavily defended, with approximately 1 machine gun position every 50 yards atop the wall. Inside the gate was reinforced with a formidable barrier of sandbags. Chinese infantry armed with mortars and small arms could fire down on the Japanese attackers, while others had established isolated positions in nearby buildings that had survived the scorched earth policy. Taking the gate in the heavily fortified southwestern corner of the wall was the responsibility of the 6th Division. The division was redeploying its regiments, the 13th, 47th, and 23rd from the east to the west. The 45th Regiment, the final unit of the division, was tasked with skirting the western side of the wall and advancing northward, aiming for the Yangtze docks at Xiaoguan. The soldiers of the division had already formed a rough understanding of the formidable defenses they were facing. During the night between the 11th and 12th, they had advanced nearly to the wall, gathering intelligence to prepare for the assault at dawn. As planned, the assault commenced. Field artillery fired round upon round at the gate, but the wall sustained minimal damage. As Japanese tanks rolled up, firing at point-blank range at the gate, produced little effect. Next, it was the engineers' turn. A dare-to-die squad equipped with long ladders crept as close to the wall as possible without exposing themselves, and then they sprinted the final distance. The moment they broke into the open, a Chinese machine gun opened fire, cutting them down to the last man. At noon, 3 Japanese planes soared overhead, dropping bombs near a Chinese-held building outside the gate. The smoke from the resulting fire briefly obscured the area, and seizing the opportunity presented by the reduced visibility, a large group of Chinese soldiers, holed up in sight, attempted to dash back to the wall. The Japanese spotted their movement instantly, and every soldier in the line opened fire. The fleeing Chinese were mowed down like grass. Meanwhile, the battle for the Gate of Enlightenment was drawing to a close. On the Chinese side of the wall, confusion reigned regarding the overall situation on the 12th. Chen Yiding, brigade commander of the 87th Division, had been warned that heads would roll if the Gate of Enlightenment fell to the Japanese. Hearing the sounds of fierce fighting on the edges of Yuhatai and seeing the smoke rise from numerous fires along Purple Mountain, he was left in the dark about their implications, surrounded by the fog of war. Chen Yiding's troops had finally managed to establish a telephone link to the rear, but by mid-afternoon it was cut off, likely due to stray artillery fire. After dark, Chen Yiding sent an officer to his left flank to make contact with the Chinese forces there. The report that followed was far from reassuring. A unit from Guangdong was abandoning its position and retreating north, attempting to exit the capital through one of the gates in the city wall. The officer had attempted to inquire about their destination, but the retreating soldiers simply ignored him. With neighboring units evacuating autonomously, a significant gap was opening in the Chinese lines atop the wall between the Gate of Enlightenment and the Sun Yat-sen Gate. A frightening possibility emerged. The Japanese could walk right in across the undefended southeastern corner of the city wall and surround Chen Yiding's troops before they even had a chance to escape. The situation was becoming untenable, a fact underscored by artillery fire raining down on Chen's position. Despite this, retreat was not a simple decision for Chen Yiding and the other commanders of the 87th Division. They had been garrisoned in Nanjing before the war. The city had become a home to many of the soldiers. Shortly after midnight, Chen Yiding called a meeting with his senior officers, and after considerable discussion, they concluded that they had no choice but to withdraw. Nonetheless, Chen insisted that everyone sign a document confirming their support for this decision, recognizing the potential danger of taking a significant step without consensus. After all, his own life had been threatened if the situation deteriorated further. Soon thereafter, the Chinese began to move out of their positions. The Japanese were initially unaware of this retreat. All they noticed during the night between the 12th and 13th was that the Chinese artillery fire began to grow increasingly distant. By 4 a.m., it had stopped completely. The few remaining Chinese were quickly overwhelmed and they were killed. In the end, the gate, which had cost so many lives during the seemingly endless battle, was taken almost effortlessly by the Japanese. Soldiers of the 9th Division stationed outside the wall scrambled up the slope created by the previous day's shelling. Once at the top, they thrust their hands into the air, shouting "Banzai," so loudly that they believed their families back home in Japan might actually hear them. Tears streamed down their faces as soldiers embraced and shook hands, reflecting on the friends that they had lost throughout the months of their fighting. from Shanghai to Nanjing. They reassured each other their sacrifices had been worth all of it. On the 12th, the slopes of Purple Mountain were all ablaze. Zhou Jianchang, commander of the Train Division's 1st Brigade, led his men in a desperate struggle to maintain control over the mountain's forested peaks. However, they were being overwhelmed by the better-equipped Japanese troops, and Zhou knew it was only a matter of time before they would have to relinquish his position. Zhou found himself unable to obtain any information from his superiors about the overall situation, despite repeated attempts to contact the Train Division's headquarters. So he dispatched a runner, who returned a few hours later with some disheartening news. The divisional commander had actually left later that afternoon. Other reports indicated a general breakdown in command. The elite 88th Division was in disarray. An entire division of Guangdong troops, that had been the same force that had abandoned the wall near the Gate of Enlightenment, had been spotted marching out of the Gate of Great Peace, seemingly intent on returning home. With indications of a complete collapse all around him, Zhou decided to execute an orderly withdrawal from Purple Mountain, leaving a small contingent behind to cover the retreat. His troops entered through the city wall at Enlightenment Gate and marched in disciplined columns through the streets of Nanjing, where signs of imminent anarchy were evident. Chinese soldiers speaking all sorts of dialects were scattered everywhere, yet they appeared to lack any coherent command. Tong Chengju's grip on the situation was weakening. Meanwhile, Japan's 13th Air Group had been busy with the final stages of the Battle of Nanjing. In the morning of the 12th, after raiding Chinese positions at Enlightenment Gate, they received new orders. Intelligence indicated that Chinese ships laden with troops were moving up the Yangtze from Nanjing. Japanese infantry on the ground could only watch as this prize slipped from their fingers, and the army requested air support. All available planes at Zhongzhou, a mix of A4N fighters and Yokozuka B-4Y bombers, totaling 24 aircraft, were assembled for the mission. The day was clear, providing excellent visibility as the pilots headed towards the section of Yangtze where they believed the vessels would be, based on reasonable assumptions about their speed. At 1:30 p.m., 28 nautical miles upriver from Nanjing, the pilots sighted 4 ships. Trusting their military intelligence, they saw no need for further identification. Initially, the B-4Ys bombed the vessels from a considerable height. One bomb struck the lead ship, a military vessel, disabling its forward gun and snapping the foremast. Then the first wave of 6 A4Ns dove down over the line of ships, attacking individually. In total, they dropped about 20 bombs. Several exploded close enough to the lead vessel to damage its hull and injure the crew members. A .30 caliber machine gun on board was manned with gunners stripped to the waist, firing at the Japanese planes but failing to score a single hit. Several of the A4Ns strafed the ship with machine gun fire. After 20 minutes of sustained bombing and strafing, the result was utter devastation. The lead vessel was stuck in the mid-river, riddled with bullets of flame and listing to starboard. 2 other ships were beached on the right bank, while another was stranded on the left. Satisfied with their mission, the Japanese aviators broke off and they returned to their temporary base. Upon their landing in Zhongzhou, instead of receiving accolades, the pilots were met with reprimands. Why hadn't they sunk all the vessels, they were asked. They were ordered to return immediately to finish the job. Though they didn't find the original targets, they stumbled upon 4 other vessels closer to Nanjing. One aircraft dove towards the ship, releasing a 60-kilogram bomb that struck one of the vessels. As the pilot pulled up, he caught sight of the Union Jack on the hull, and he realized his mistake. He had inadvertently targeted neutral ships. The other pilots recognized the significance of the markings as well, and withheld their bombs. This vessel was identified as the SS Huangtung. Soon thereafter, the Japanese pilots understood that the ships that they had attacked earlier upriver from Nanjing were also Western. 3 of them were Standard Oil tankers. The last vessel, which had sustained the most damage, was actually the USS Panay, a lightly armed flat-bottomed gunboat, tasked with protecting American lives and property along China's longest river. The Panay had been instrumental in evacuating American citizens from the war zone in November and December. On the day it was attacked, the Panay was carrying 4 American embassy personnel and 10 Americans and foreign journalists to safety. The ship's doctor converted the engine room into a makeshift sick bay, treating a steady stream of injured personnel. By the end, he was attending about 45 patients. The soldiers and passengers were evacuated in 2 small boats to a nearby marshy island covered in some reeds, where they hid, fearful of further strafing. From their hiding place, they watched as a Japanese powerboat filled with some soldiers approached the Panay. After firing more volleys at the vessel, the soldiers boarded it, remaining for only 5 minutes before departing. The American flag still flew at the bow at the time. At 3:54 p.m., the Panay rolled over to her starboard and she sank in 7 to 10 fathoms of water. Cold and frightened, the survivors waded through knee-deep mud to a nearby village, assisting those too severely wounded to walk. Meanwhile, back at the Chinese gate, the mutual slaughter continued into the afternoon of December the 12th. The Japanese made no significant progress, although their failure was not for lack of trying. The commanders of the 6th Division had strategically placed the boundary between the 13th and 47th Regiments exactly at the gate, encouraging both units to compete to be the first to seize the position. Yet, despite their efforts, it became clear that willpower alone was not enough to breach the Chinese defenses at the Chinese gate. During peacetime, Nanjing City gates served as entry points into the bustling capital, but in wartime they transformed into heavily fortified and nearly impregnable strongholds. Any Japanese officer hoping for a swift victory would soon be disappointed. By early afternoon, the situation at the gate had devolved into a stalemate. The section of the wall manned by the 47th Infantry Regiment, located east of the gate, also saw little meaningful movement as the day wore on. Japanese soldiers pinned down by Chinese fire from atop the wall could do little more than take pride in their symbolic triumph. A small group of soldiers had managed to reach the wall and place a ladder against it, but it fell nearly 10 feet short of the top. One very brave soldier skillfully scaled the last portion, gripping protruding bricks and crevices of the nearly vertical surface. The entire Japanese front watched him with bated breath. He reached the top and he unfurled the Japanese flag, but it immediately drew intense Chinese fire, forcing him to duck for cover. Soon he vanished from sight, raising concerns amongst his comrades. Later it was revealed that he had taken refuge in a depression in the wall, waiting out the battle. Now the real breakthrough of the day would occur west of the gate. The 23rd Regiment was deployed there with orders to capture sections of the wall near the southwestern corner. It became evident that the wall could not be scaled without first bringing up artillery to create gaps in its solid masonry. A significant portion of the divisional fire support, 36 small-caliber mountain guns, 4 100mm howitzers, and 4 150mm howitzers were assigned to the section. Artillery observers were also sent to the 23rd Regiment's forward command post to coordinate with the infantry and assess the effects of the shelling. By mid-afternoon, the artillery bombardment had created a ravine-like hole in the wall large enough for an assault. The 23rd Regiment positioned its 2nd and 3rd Battalions at the front, with the 1st Battalion held back in reserve. First, the engineers undertook the challenging task. As the assault commenced, the rest of the regiment provided covering fire to force the Chinese defenders to seek shelter, while the engineers charged into the 70-foot wide moat. Once a human chain formed, they held up ladders as makeshift bridges and allowed a company of the 3rd Battalion to rush across into the gap in the wall. As the batteries switched to close infantry support, they laid down a barrage around the breach to prevent Chinese interference as the attack entered a decisive phase. The Japanese soldiers scrambled up the rubble created by the artillery fire, which rose several dozen feet high. Shortly before 5 p.m., the Japanese seized control of the southwestern segment of the wall. The Chinese launched several counterattacks to reclaim the position, but none were successful. This action ultimately sealed Nanjing's fate. Beyond the wall, there was nothing left to save the ancient city and her inhabitants. As defeat appeared imminent, more and more civilians sought safety in the foreign-controlled areas, though danger still loomed large. Bits of shrapnel narrowly missed Dr. Robert Wilson while he was operating in the safety zone. Every square foot of John Rabe's property became filled with families, many camping in the open with their own blankets. Some sought refuge under his large swastika flag, believing that this would make the area especially bomb-proof, given the growing friendship between Tokyo and Berlin. They assumed Japanese aviators would think twice before targeting a region seemingly under German protection. With just hours left before the Japanese army was expected to gain control, the residents of Nanjing made their last preparations, prioritizing personal survival. The brutal behavior of Japanese troops in conquering territories fueled intense concerns over the possible fate of injured soldiers who might fall into enemy hands. As Nanjing's last hours as a free city unfolded, it became imperative for local hospitals to evacuate as many wounded soldiers as possible across the Yangtze. On December the 12th, doctors found a motorboat stranded on the riverbank, having apparently broken down. They managed to repair it and ferried several hundred patients to safety throughout the day. Throughout the 12th, the citizens of Nanjing were subjected to the unsettling cacophony of heavy shelling mixed with the roar of bombers overhead. By evening, the entire horizon south of the city glowed white with flames. The sound of fighting emanated from all directions, continuing long after sunset. However, in the middle of the night, activity began to wane. Every few minutes, the muffled thuds of shells could still be heard, though their origin was unclear. For the most part, an eerie silence prevailed, as the city was holding its breath in anticipation of the final onslaught. Now, Chiang Kai-shek had indicated he would understand if Tang Chong-je chose to abandon the capital. However, on the 12th, he suddenly reversed his stance, sending a telegram to Tang expressing optimism that the Nanjing garrison could hold out significantly longer. If you do not shy away from your sacrifices, you will be able to hold high the banner of our nation and our army, and this could transform defeat into victory. If you can hold out one more day, you will add to the pride of the Chinese nation. If you can hold out half a month or more, the domestic and international situation could see a substantial change. Tang Chong-je adopted a hardline approach towards any signs of defeatism amongst his troops. When he learned that General Sun Yuanliang, commander of the former Elite 88th Division, was leading approximately 2,000 men from the Gate of Enlightenment to the dock area, well, he acted swiftly. He dispatched Song Xilian, the commanding general of the 36th Division, to halt the retreat. When the two units met, a clash nearly occurred. Fortunately, the 88th Division agreed to return to the gate and continue the fighting. However, whatever Tang Chong-je planned, it became irrelevant at 3 p.m., when he received another telegram from Chiang Kai-shek, this time ordering a full retreat. Rumors that the Chinese army had started evacuating Nanjing triggered panic amongst many units. Thousands abandoned their positions and they joined the throngs of soldiers and civilians moving slowly down the city's main avenues. The crowd seemed to have collectively decided that getting a boat out of Nanjing was the best option. And by the late afternoon, a solid mass of humanity stretched for miles through the city towards the dock areas at Xiaguan. To reach Xiaguan, everyone had to pass through Yijiang Gate. This relatively modern structure had served as the main entry point for visitors arriving to Nanjing by boat in the recent decade. However, a very large crowd was trying to get through a very narrow bottleneck. It was a recipe for disaster. Those unfortunate enough to be right at the front felt the crushing pressure of tens of thousands of individuals pushing from behind. In that densely packed throng, stumbling and falling to the ground was akin to a death sentence. Anyone who went down was crushed to death. As the chaos erupted, discipline evaporated entirely. Officers lost control of their men, leading to infighting amongst the soldiers. Pushing and shoving escalated into fistfights, and trucks drove directly into masses of people to force their way through. Tanks simply rolled right through mobs, crushing many under their weight. Amidst all of the chaos, some soldiers, driven by frustration over the lack of movement, simply began shooting into the crowd. To relieve the pressure on the Yijiang Gate, some units were ordered to exit Nanjing via the Gate of Great Peace at the northeastern corner of the city wall. Upon arrival, they found the entrance nearly sealed shut. Thick walls of sandbags had been erected around it, leaving only a narrow opening through which one person could pass at a time. Massive crowds fought amongst themselves to get through. Even under perfect order and discipline, it would have taken the entire night and most of the following day for everyone to pass. In the midst of the frantic chaos, it could take a week or more. During the night of the 12th, a group of Japanese soldiers chosen for the offensive stripped their equipment down to the bare necessities, rifles, bayonets, and helmets. They avoided any gear that could produce a metallic noise, alerting the Chinese defenders of their approach. Stealthily, they moved up the wall, carrying bamboo ladders tied together in threes for added height. Ascending the rungs, they ensured not to make a single sound. Everything hinged on remaining undetected. Even a couple of hand grenades tossed down the wall could halt the attack in its tracks. Reaching the top without being noticed, the soldiers quickly fanned out. Chinese soldiers stationed on the wall saw the swift, dark figures and opened fire, but it was too late to thwart the assault. A brief fight ensued. Most of the Japanese soldiers were too close to use their rifles and immediately resorted to their bayonets. The stunned defenders were pushed back, and the successful assault team established a perimeter, awaiting reinforcements from outside the wall. And they didn't have long to wait. A massive assault along the length of the 6th Division's front line commenced at dawn on the 13th. Japanese artillery concentrated its fire on a narrow section on the city wall, progressively working its way from the bottom up. Gradually, the shells formed a slope of debris that soldiers could use to scale the wall. A short air raid was executed, and after the planes had weakened the remaining resistance, a group of soldiers rushed up the slope. While their comrades provided covering fire, they climbed the last stretch, rolling down a rope ladder. Within minutes, 40 other Japanese soldiers had joined them. By 10:30 a.m., the rising sun flag was flying over the wall. The Japanese invaders were met with a horrific sight at the top of the wall. Beyond lay the grim aftermath of days of shelling. Some houses were leveled while others burned. The ground was littered with bodies, some decapitated or disemboweled, and pools of blood surrounded them. As Chiang Kai-shek's order to abandon the city gradually filtered down to the troops manning the wall around Nanjing, things began to move rapidly. On the morning of the 13th, all the major entry points into the city had fallen to the Japanese. These included the Chinese Gate in the southwest, the Gate of Enlightenment in the south, and the Sun Yat-sen Gate in the east. The first thing that struck the Japanese soldiers upon ascending the wall was how starkly different it was from their expectation. They had anticipated a bustling city teeming with people, but instead the area adjacent to the wall was characterized by farm plots resembling the countryside more than an urban center. The second notable observation was the complete absence of any inhabitants. Cautiously, the Japanese soldiers entered the city that they had just conquered, their bayonets fixed and rifles at ready. Yet surprisingly, very few shots were fired. After weeks of fearing death and injury, once the immediate danger receded, a certain stupor fell in. For most civilians in Nanjing, their initial encounter with the city's new rulers was uneventful. It would take several hours for the Japanese to move from the wall into the urban parts of the capital. It was not until around noon that residents noticed the first group of Japanese soldiers marching down the streets in clusters of 6 to 12 men. Initially, many met the conquerors with relief, hoping that they would be treated fairly. Their optimism was bolstered by Japanese planes dropping leaflets over the city, reassuring residents of humane treatment. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you'd like to support me further, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. On December the 9th, fierce battles erupted, especially at the Gate of Enlightenment. Despite heavy fighting, the Chinese showed remarkable resilience, turning Nanjing into a symbol of determination. However, the tide shifted as overwhelming Japanese artillery and tactics began to breach defenses. By the 13th, as chaos engulfed the city, the invaders claimed victory, but not without significant losses. Civilians caught amidst the destruction clung to hope amidst despair.